Warlords of Draenor, one of WoW's most infamous expansions. Whenever something bad happens in World of Warcraft, generally they'll use Warlords of Draenor as a measuring stick. To say, sure, this new feature is kinda bad, but it's not as bad as this thing from Warlords of Draenor. And to an extent, it deserves some of that criticism. Blizzard themselves even apologized for the expansion. But was it really that bad? When Warlords of Draenor first launched, you might be surprised to hear that it set records for returning players. There was almost nothing but positivity about the expansion online, once people were able to play the game anyway. Although rocky launches aren't exclusive to Warlords of Draenor. So why were people so jazzed about the expansion at first? Let's dissect the questing real quick. WoD had this system called Draenor Perks, where when you were leveling up, every 2 levels or so, they would just give you a boost to one of your main damage dealing abilities, or just something that you use all the time. For Shadow Priests, they would get a perk that allowed their Mind Flay to channel 33% faster, which is just straight up a damage boost to one of their main filler spells. They also received a feature which enhanced Shadow Orbs, which was actually a pretty big deal for DPS back then, because it meant it was much harder for them to cap their main resource. They were also given the ability to generate that resource with another skill, and allowed to use their main defensive cooldown more often. MM Hunters received a base bonus to their focus by 20, Survival Hunters got a straight up 1 second increase to their explosive shot, which is huge for their main damage dealing ability at the time. Mages got a speed boost after using Blink, Arcane Mages got a buff to the Arcane Blast, which allowed them to cast it faster every time they gained a stack. Basically, every class and spec received huge boosts to their damage or utility while leveling up, and got to keep these boosts for the entire expansion. So it was one of the last expansions where your character actually felt stronger as they leveled up, rather than getting weaker. The zones themselves also contributed to this. Every single zone in Warlords of Draenor had the very specific zone perk, and when you started off in Frostfire Ridge or Shadowmoon Valley, you would get a specific ability that only worked inside the zone in the open world. And the default one you got allowed you to basically summon a small army to help you fight something. When you moved over to Gorgon, they would let you choose between 2 abilities. One of them allowed you to summon a mech suit that was actually very effective at mowing down adds, and even gave you the niche ability to fly for a short amount of time. It was a huge legitimate DPS increase to be able to use the Mech Shredder 5000, but it was only available to this one zone. You also had access to the Champion's Honor, which would summon a champion to help fight for you, and then give you a buff after he went away in a minute, which would be stronger based on how many enemies you killed while the ad was out. In the Spires of Iraq, you had the option between picking an extra Hearthstone with a reduced cooldown that also increased your experience gained by 20%, or a rare NPC vendor who you could summon every 10 minutes, which would sell you a whole bunch of buff items that would directly increase your damage. Almost everyone picked the Hearthstone because of the increased XP, but both of them were great options to pick. And the extra Hearthstone combined with the extra XP made Spires of Iraq one of the fastest leveling zones. In Talador, you had the option between 2 different DPS cooldowns. One of them would summon a Guardian Orb that would come out and electrocute enemies, and the other one was 3 Charge Artillery Strike, which was off cooldown enough where it was basically part of your rotation by the end of the zone. In the Grand, you have the option to pick either a Siege Engine you can summon once every 10 minutes, just like the mech suit from Gorgon, or you could pick a mount that you could ride in combat. One of them is a temporary cooldown DPS boost. The other one is such an incredible convenience that I'm sure many people wish they could have it as a default option for leveling. So when it came to the actual combat and leveling in the zones, getting a whole bunch of really strong abilities as you leveled up, as well as getting really strong zone abilities, really made the leveling a lot more fun from just a gameplay point of view. They really knocked out of the park with just giving you fun things to do that you're basically only going to use while leveling. And I'm not sure why they didn't follow up and try to do this again, outside of what they did with the Covenant abilities. But honestly, all of the Covenant abilities are very tame compared to what the zone perks would give you. Although it wasn't just the player's power while leveling, as sure, you were really strong while leveling in Warlords of Draenor, but also Warlords really went all out with treasures and introducing the bonus objective system, where while you're randomly questing, you'll get a bonus objective that pops up, and if you complete it, it will just give you a crap ton of experience. It was so much experience that you could skip leveling normally and just do bonus objectives. Same with treasures. There was a whole bunch of treasures littered throughout all of the zones. And while the treasures themselves only gave minor cosmetic items or a little bit of garrison resources, they would also give you about as much experience as completing a quest, before Blizzard nerfed them later on. Leveling through Warlords of Draenor was the fastest old expansion to level through because you could just skip traditional leveling entirely by just collecting treasures and bonus objectives. and that was on top of the leveling itself also being excellent. Now, I know Warlords of Draenor gets lots of crap for some of the worst writing of all the expansions, and for how tired everyone was of the Garrisons, but these were both actually really good at the start. While you first build up your garrison, you could recruit followers that would help you out for missions out in the open world, and since the original soft cap was around 20 followers, that meant you had to go out and collect a lot of different people in order to hit that first soft cap. And most of them were creatures you would find out in the open world that you just helped with side quests, which really gave you a lot more of an incentive to want to do side quests, because there wasn't always an option that it might be a follower. And since you needed so many of them, more than half the time it was a follower you could recruit. I don't think WoW has really incentivized doing side quests as much as Warlords of Draenor did, because they led to either a new follower for your garrison, a huge amount of extra experience with the side objectives, or just a normal big amount of experience for finding a treasure, even doing the little puzzle that was required in order to get to most of them without flying. And then there was also the story, which was actually pretty good in the leveling experience. Warlords was the only expansion that had full cinematics for every zone, and some of them were very iconic and memorable to this day, especially the ending to Nagrand, which had Thrall and Garrosh fight each other. It's probably one of the most well-known and loved in-game cinematics, and it was shown at the end of a leveling zone. There's also the whole story with Gunnar, where for the Horde questing for Frostfire Ridge, you go around helping out Durotan's brother, who was the uncle of Thrall. And throughout the zone, he'll come in and help you fight back the Iron Horde, and he does such a successful job at it that he thinks he should be the one that leads the Frostwolf clan. So halfway through the zone story, he goes up to Durotan and challenges him to a mock Garra in order to be the new chieftain. And instead of Durotan getting mad at him, or just talking him out of it peacefully by saying, "We're brothers, we shouldn't be fighting," or something else cliche, what he actually does is he just throws down his weapons and walks up to him and basically just tells him to do it. He just says, "If you want to be war chief so bad, just kill me. But see how many people follow you after you kill your brother in cold blood." And since Gunnar wasn't expecting this, at all, he just puts his weapons away and says, "Damn, son, that's not how this is supposed to go down. Okay, fine, you're the chieftain." And then he begrudgingly follows Durotar for the rest of the zone, where you go around trying to clean up the third oldest brother's mess, as he's the one who's leading the Iron Horde in the area. At the very end of the questline in the zone, the Iron Horde is about to send their army through a passage in order to help reinforce in the final battle. The Frostwolf clan is incredibly outnumbered, and it was crazy for them to want to fight back in the first place. So they try to tactically have one of their legendary shamans, Drekthar, basically collapse the valley, which would allow them to clean house on the other side with the lower numbers, and basically take the area for themselves before reinforcements could find another way around. However, the men were getting real close to the shaman in order to stop this whole plan from happening, and the Frostwolf were losing men very quickly. So Durotan knew the only way for them to win was if he took a small group of their most elite soldiers to just basically stall for time, but at the cost of dying along with the rock collapse. And Gunnar held them back and just runs in by himself, and then the cinematic for the zone plays, which details Gunnar's solo suicide charge into the ranks, fighting a battle he knows he can't win, which won them the battle ultimately when they successfully collapsed the valley on top of him. This zone has one of the best moments of character writings I've seen in WoW. It goes from you having to rescue Gunnar when he's shoveling poop in an Iron Horde prison, to watching him challenge his brother to a death duel, to seeing him give up his life in order to save him instead. And I was so impressed by this story that I even made a video about Gunnar back in Warlords of Draenor, specifically to share with everyone else who might have missed it. It's not an exaggeration to say that the leveling in Warlords of Draenor was the best new content expansion leveling we've ever gotten. It set the peak for how to start off a new expansion, and just like how the Timeless Isle set the standard for how to create a new zone in an expansion, it basically did everything right. It provided multiple avenues to level up your character, and gave you a whole bunch of strong new abilities that you could use just long enough to like them, but then giving you a new one immediately to play with. It increased the power level of your character, encouraged exploration with how much experience the treasures gave and how almost all the side quests would award a follower, and had interesting stories to tell. There's also the story of Ishkar and the Spires of Iraq, the story with Velen and Shadowmoon, and the story of Murad and Talador, all of which topped off with full-length cinematics at the end. You can see why there was nothing but positive words to be said about the leveling experience in Warlords of Draenor. But that's not the only thing they did right. While Warlords of Draenor only had 3 raids in the entire expansion, 2 of the raids are some of the best raids we've ever gotten. Even the 3rd raid, High Mall, was also a good raid. But if you were to ask me my absolute favorite raid in WoW's history that I've personally done, I would probably have to say Blackrock Foundry, the 2nd raid that was released in WoD. Blackrock Foundry did something that no other raid has done since. They went ham on unique boss fights. Hans and Franz is still wholly unique in its belt mechanic, where basically you're fighting 2 bosses at the same time, and while you're fighting them, you're in a room which has a constant conveyor belt going back and forth. While on the conveyor belt, there's stamps that will occasionally come down and either damage you on lower difficulties, or instantly kill you on higher ones. And while there were little sections of the fight where you could stand still and not be on the conveyor belt, occasionally void zones would come out and would force you to get on the belt anyway. There's even a section of the fight where you basically just have to do the safety dance and just move out of the press while on the conveyor belt still going back and forth. There's also Ore Gorger, which had you fight in a little maze, and periodically throughout the fight he would just start rolling around, which made the entire raid have to run around the little maze and DPS crates so that he would eat the ore in them and end the phase and go back to a normal boss fight. This is another fight which is wholly unique, as you had to split up the raid in order to run around and DPS all the crates, and of course avoid the boss who's rolling around trying to kill you, so that you could have enough in order to end the phase before he rolled over and just killed everyone. Blackhand himself, the final boss, was also pretty unique for the time. While the fight itself was pretty generic, they did have a gimmick to the fight where every phase of the fight happened on a different level of the boss room. Phase 1 would be on the top level. When you transition, he would just break the floor and take you to the 2nd level. Once the 2nd phase is over, he would break the floor again and take you to the bottom level, where you had to deal with knockback mechanics that could instantly kill you if you fell off into the lava. And it was such a loved final boss fight, it was kind of softly copied again for Castle Nathria. And Blackhand was appropriately difficult in its hardest difficulty, being one of the hardest boss fights of all time in its mythic mode. And then there's everyone's favorite boss fight of the expansion, Operator Thogar, where you would fight him in a room with 4 train tracks, and periodically throughout the fight, trains would just come out and kill anyone that was in its path. And sometimes trains would come and stop in order to deposit ads at you to fight, and basically the entire fight was just dodging trains and killing ads that came from those trains, and if you didn't kill them fast enough, then too many trains would come in and kill you while you were trying to get the others to go away. Now, unique boss fights can be a good or bad thing. People complain a lot about Hans and Franz for giving them motion sickness, which is probably why they never did something like that again. But Blackrock Foundry was a testament to creative boss mechanics. I don't think a raid has really matched Blackrock Foundry's level of just pure amount of unique fights since. And the thing is, the raid after, Hellfire Citadel, was also a top tier raid. You see, in Hellfire Citadel, Blizzard made some of the most complicated fight mechanics that we've ever made in boss fights. And they were so complicated because add-ons at the time allowed them to show you a lot more information inside of raids than they do today. I still have some footage from back in the day when we were doing Mythic Cormrock, where there was a phase where everyone in the raid had to run to a specific assigned void zone in order to soak. And the way you would deal with this mechanic was just to have an add-on to literally have an arrow on the screen that would point you exactly where you needed to go, as it was set up before the fight started. During the final fight with Archimonde, there was a mechanic where it'd shoot lasers through people, where you only wanted the lasers to go through the 2 people selected, so you had to coordinate yourself in a way so it would only pass through those 2 people and not anyone else. And at the Mythic difficulty, this basically went on everyone at once, so you had to coordinate the entire raid in order to not allow a single laser to overlap and hit anyone, which was basically accomplished through an add-on. There's also Shadow Lord Ishkar, which had a mechanic where you had to throw around an item that gave you an extra action button in order to interact with all the mechanics in the fight. While it may not be as good as Blackrock Foundry, it was still also an excellent raid, and was basically the upper limit for how difficult boss mechanics could be. There hasn't really been a raid with mechanics as difficult as Hellfire Citadel since, but at the time, they weren't that big of a deal because of how great add-ons were, and instead they were just kind of well liked. And Archimonde himself proved to be a huge challenge as a final boss, as I think he took number 8 on my list of the hardest bosses of all time list. So, when it came to raid content, it was actually excellent. The reason the raids aren't talked about as much as some of the more iconic ones, like maybe Old War or ICC, is because the expansion itself has a negative rap, which means it's not a good idea to talk about the positive aspects, because talking about negativity just straight up gets more clicks and views than talking about positives, Even if people did talk about the positives, they just aren't heard by as many people as all the negatives. And there's also lots of features that were introduced in WoD that many people still enjoy to this day. Warlords was the expansion that upgraded the heirloom tab, which basically allows you to equip heirlooms on brand new characters without having to mail them. They also added a tab for toys and tabards, so you no longer need to hold them in your inventory. Warlords also improved the flight path. Before Warlords of Draenor, if you wanted to fly from one place to another, and there wasn't a connecting flight path discovered, then you would be unable to fly there until you got the connecting path. But with WoD, they made it so even if you did not have the connecting flight path, you could still fly to the path you did have. And with the new Stop Flight button, a button so useful they even added it to the No Changes Classic WoW. This button appears when you get on a flight path, and when clicked, automatically cancels your flight, causing you to stop flying wherever you're going and land at the next stop that you have known. Forgot to get something in your bank mid-flight? Well, cancel and go back. No longer have to wait for your entire flight to finish. They also added a thing called Mercenary Mode. See, sometimes one faction has way more players than the other in PvP, and because of this, that one faction has insanely long PvP queues. So Merc Mode allowed players of the opposite faction to queue up for a PvP member of the other faction, in a way to help reduce queue times. This feature was so well liked that players have been asking for it to be usable in PvE modes as well, to cut back on how horde-dominated high-level play is. WoD was also when they updated character models from all the vanilla and TBC races. These models kept true to their original feeling while updating them into the new era, bringing them up to line with the more updated WoW art style. People like this change so much that they keep asking for Blizzard to update their character models with every new expansion. And the biggest feature they added, Garrisons, was a light version of player housing that people have been asking for since day one. While it did not fulfill the role of player housing, it did allow for players to build their own, well, garrisons. A base they controlled what buildings got made, where they got placed, and where the buildings got various perks and buffs, like a portal to any zone you wanted, a faster mount speed, or being able to cut down trees or capture animals. And one of the things players liked was if you combo specific buildings together, you were able to get tens of thousands of gold a week on each character, to build up a nice stockpile, simply by recruiting followers who had special traits that doubled gold for missions, and then sending 3 followers with the perk all on the same gold missions. And by doing the daily quests from some of the buildings, all of which could be done in about 5 minutes per character, and was the easiest gold making you could possibly do in any expansion without having to sell stuff on the auction house. You know the weekly events we have in modern WoW? Well, those were actually added with Warlords of Draenor and were called bonus events at first. These events ran every Friday to Monday and had all sorts of things to them, like bonus loot from dungeons, honor from battlegrounds and arenas, pet experience from pet battles, and bonus Apexis crystals later changed into world quests. It also had this fancy new thing added in Warlords of Draenor called Time Walking. Time Walking allowed players at max level to scale down to heroic versions of old dungeons and later raids. It launched with Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King, and Cataclysm, filled with dungeons to do, with a currency called Time Warp Badges, that could be used to buy all sorts of stuff from toys, pets, transmog, and even rep from old expansions. And don't worry, by the way, the bonus events were increased from just the weekend to all week to be the weekly events we have today. And the time walking currency introduced in this expansion is one of the few currencies that transcends expansions, and is just as valuable as it was back then as it is today. So with all of these great features of Warlords of Draenor, why does it go down as one of the most infamous expansions? It doesn't have a scrub progression system like Azerite armor, it didn't remove the old world like Cataclysm, it didn't introduce a controversial race like the Pandaren. In fact, it just introduced a whole bunch of features that a lot of people really liked. It even had borrowed power without anyone knowing it was borrowed power. And no one ever complains about the Draenor perks of Warlords of Draenor when discussing things like artifacts, the Heart of Azeroth, or covenants. It seems to be one of the few expansions that did borrow power from the expansions correctly. It even had tier set bonuses, and the final boss would drop a trinket that was so impactful to your class that it was basically like having a new talent. And some of those trinket effects were so good, they basically changed your entire rotation around them. So the gear in the expansion was good too. Now, one of the most infamous moments of Warlords of Draenor was definitely its patch 6.1. In this patch, it's one of the few major content patches which added the least amount of new content, allegedly. It basically just added a whole bunch of minor things, like the mentioned heirloom upgrade, a few things for garrisons, a couple of new toys, and Twitter integration. It was commonly memed that this was the selfie patch, as it was the patch that introduced the selfie cam toy. Although what's largely forgotten when this patch is brought up is the fact that Blizzard had stated beforehand that with Warlords of Draenor they wanted to go back to naming minor patches after full numbers rather than as like 0.5s. Normally, when they had a minor patch, they would just add a 0.5 to the end of whatever the current patch was. So currently, as of making this video, Shadowlands is in its patch 9.0.5. And that's because they did a minor patch update which added a couple of new features, but nothing major like a new raid or dungeon. If Blizzard named the patch which introduced the Valor system as patch 9.1 for example, people would get really mad because they're used to numbered patches being big. As 9.0.5, no one cares about that. Patch 6.1 was them trying to go back to just naming content updates that don't have something major with just full numbers, as this is something they used to do in Vanilla WoW and the Burning Crusade. In the Burning Crusade, patch 2.2 was literally just adding the voice chat integration, and a lot of the patches of Vanilla WoW just had game updates and no real content, as Vanilla WoW ended off on patch 1.12, but didn't have 12 raids that released, for example. But since people were so used to full numbered patches having a raid or something else major, there was a huge backlash at them for daring to call it patch 6.1. When all they did was consolidate all the heirlooms into a more convenient interface that can be used on all new players, and gave people the selfie cam. Even though we had a full patch in the Burning Crusade which just added voice chat that no one used. That is to say, WoW fans did what they do best and basically blew a minor complaint way out of proportion, where it's still talked about as a bad part of Warlords of Draenor to this day. And because people freaked out so much about 6.1, Blizzard doesn't do that anymore, and more appropriately just adds one more decimal point in, when they have a minor patch update, usually in the form of 0.5 patches. Another big complaint about Warlords of Draenor was the Garrisons themselves. People really liked the Garrisons for the first month while they were still questing through the excellent zones getting all the followers, but at a certain point, you were just kinda done. The Garrisons were fun when you were advancing them, but you can completely max them out and finish the content in your garrison after about a month or two. And so once people hit this threshold, they were mad that the Garrisons didn't do more. You could still do the dailies in your garrison every day in order to earn more gold without having to use the auction house than at any other point in WoW's history, but people really wanted more to do with the Garrisons, and since they kind of hit the wall of available content for it pretty early, they instead got tired of it and just called it a bad feature. They also didn't like how major cities were unoccupied because everyone was just in their garrison. They made the Garrisons really convenient for doing pretty much everything, as you could even get an auction house NPC in one of your garrison buildings, that there wasn't really a reason to visit major cities anymore. And so, with a combination of making it feel like the open world had less people in it, and because they wanted more cosmetic options for the Garrisons, they kind of turned against it midway through the expansion. There was nothing wrong with the Garrisons themselves, other than the fact that they were too useful. They provided ore and herbs so long as you didn't mind clearing out your herb garden or mine every day. You didn't really need ore and herbs from the auction house because you could just get your own. There was even a building that allowed you to disenchant your gear, so you didn't need to be an enchanter. And it even had access to a bank, so you could just kind of have a mini city inside your garrison. And with how popular Classic WoW is, with how much people were excited about them taking away conveniences, basically the biggest sin of the garrison was just being a big convenience, which honestly doesn't seem like a bad thing. If they just went back and reiterated the garrison system to be more cosmetic focused, I'm sure people would love having more say in the cosmetics in their pseudo player house. Although funny enough, I think people would also be happy if they removed a lot of the conveniences that the garrison had. That way it was purely a cosmetic place and not as useful as it was in Warlords of Draenor. And there's also the endgame content in Warlords of Draenor. Basically, the previous expansion, Mist of Pandaria, was chock full of daily quests. Blizzard removed the daily quest limit in that expansion and then went crazy with giving daily quests to basically every zone that you needed to accomplish in order to unlock the Valor vendors. And WoD was trying to rectify that problem by not requiring people to have to grind out dailies in order to unlock vendors that they needed for raid progression, and instead you could do it for basically cosmetic rewards. In fact, the reputations were just for cosmetics as well. And since the endgame daily system didn't force you to do it, a lot of people just never did it, and then complained that there was nothing to do, even though the endgame of Warlords of Draenor was basically the same as every other expansion before it. It had raiding, dungeons, PvP, holiday events, challenge modes, gold making, pet battles. It just lacked mandatory daily quests, but still had daily quests as well. So that's why Blizzard decided to add the bonus events, which eventually became the weekly events. They did try to add new stuff, because it turns out people like to be told what to do, otherwise they just won't do anything. There was also the content drought of WoT, which was the worst ever content drought in the game's history, as they gave up on the expansion halfway through to work on Legion. So, after the last patch of 6.2, there was a huge gap before Legion finally came out. The thing is though, the gap was only about a week or two longer than the gap from Mist of Pandaria to Warlords of Draenor, and only a month longer than the gap from BFA to Shadowlands. The content drought was not really as long as it's remembered, because sure, it was technically the longest content drought in the game's history, but not by very much. Funny enough, counting the total boss counts of the 3 raids in World of Draenor and comparing it to the boss counts of raids from other expansions, it actually has the second least amount of bosses total in an expansion, with Cataclysm actually taking the number 1 spot at having the lowest boss count for its expansion, despite having 5 total raids. There's also the notion of cut content from the game, where they promised a lot more stuff with World of Draenor and BlizzCon than what we actually got. But that's kind of true for a lot of other expansions as well. There isn't a single expansion that doesn't have a plethora of cut content. Even Vanilla WoW had a whole bunch of stuff planned. According to the WoW Diary book, they wanted to add Old Outlands, Northrend, the Emerald Dream, the Dragon Isles, and the South Seas of Kulturas and Zandalar with the base game, but they were all cut in development. They were just more open about planned content in World of Draenor, and because of the backlash they received from not including some of the content they talked about, they just were more tight-lipped on what they were planning, just in case. For example, in BFA, when they were announcing a new patch, they basically only had a couple of screenshots of it for promotional material, and people thought the patch was nowhere near completion because of lack of info. But then they released the entire thing about a week later. They had the whole thing done and ready to go. They were just so conservative about releasing any information that might possibly be cut, because they didn't want a repeat of Warlords of Draenor. So there were definitely some negative aspects of Warlords of Draenor, but they were heavily exaggerated and made to be much a bigger deal than they actually were. And a lot of the content in World of Draenor was some of the best work they've ever done. It really is a gem of an expansion that had one too many scratches on its surface that people complained about until they looked like valleys. So, was Warlords of Draenor really that bad of an expansion? Not at all. It was one raid tier away from being one of the best.